Alrighty, guys. So it turns out that original DC slate that James Gunn announced is, well, it's probably a little bit out of order because it seems like we're getting new film announcements left and right here that are probably going to be coming before some of the other films that James Gunn talked about, like Swamp Thing, as an example, because we have another confirmation, and this is, I don't think it's as of the recording of this segment, this is not directly from James Gunn, but it's from the reputable sources, and it's all but confirmed that we are going to be getting a Clayface film. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Clayface, Clayface is one of the more well-known Batman villains, well, not well-known, maybe like B-tier Batman villains, and he actually, most prominently in the recent DC media, has been popping up in Harley Quinn, and he's so funny in Harley Quinn. In fact, he's voiced by Alan Tudyk, who we'll talk about in just a second, related to Clayface. But he's so funny in that show. But he, in that show, he's playing a more goofy thespian, kind of character, and not really playing it that serious because that show is a comedy at heart, right? So it's interesting because Clayface's first appearance will not be in that film, actually, whenever that film comes out. And that film, by the way, is being written, I believe, by Mike Flanagan, who does a lot of horror stuff, and he did Doctor Sleep as an example. And I think I could be wrong, but I think he was the guy who developed and show ran the Haunting of Hill House film, or series on Netflix, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but he does a lot of horror stuff. And it's interesting because, James Mangold is also doing Swamp Thing, and he's, I think, doing a more horror tilt on it. And this first chapter of the DCU is called Gods and Monsters, and obviously a lot of focus here on these monsters. Also, that Bane and Deathstroke movie. So a lot of interesting films, right? Also, Teen Titans movie is coming out. Just a really interesting slate here in the DC universe. I get that we talked about earlier. James Gunn is not greenlighting films unless they are, the scripts are done and whatnot. But it would be nice to have a full slate, or at least some kind of slate, because right now it's a whole bunch of, well, he talked about Booster Gold, he talked about Swamp Thing, he talked about Paradise Lost. Haven't heard anything about those. Meanwhile, Sergeant Rock, Teen Titans, Clayface, Bane and Deathstroke movies. So kind of interesting how James Gunn is going about talking about these films. But anyways, this Clayface movie is coming out. Now, I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about Alan Tudyk a little bit more because Alan Tudyk is voicing Clayface in Harley Quinn, obviously. In all 5 seasons of Harley Quinn is Alan Tudyk, but also it was confirmed by James Gunn that Alan Tudyk, in addition to voicing Will Magnus, I believe, and a character called Will Magnus, and also G.I. Robot in Creature Commandos, one of the main characters, that he will also be voicing an iteration of Clayface. Now, I'm going to assume that this Clayface film is going to be taking place in the same continuity as the DCU. It's DC Studios produced, so I'm just assuming that it's part of the DCU proper. And I guess that means that Alan Tudyk will be voicing Clayface again? Or playing Clayface? I'm not sure, honestly. I don't know. Part of the interesting thing about Clayface is that he can turn into anybody, right? That's at least in some iterations of the character in the comic books. He transforms and shapeshifts. So maybe it's less of a concern about who the actual Clayface is. Maybe they'll just get somebody else, and maybe Alan Tudyk is voicing a version of Clayface, one of the many faces of Clayface in Creature Commandos. And we also know that the version in Creature Commandos is going to be very different from the one in Harley Quinn. He's not going to be funny, goofy. He's going to be much more violent, which I think is also an interesting take on the character. But anyways, I think, it remains to be seen who is voicing him. But I would assume that Alan Tudyk will be returning in some capacity, depending on how this Creature Commandos thing goes. And I think that's interesting also because James Gunn talked about, reprising roles, and he said that basically if they didn't imagine you for live action, or if there wasn't an intentional direction and desire to put you into live action from animation, then they weren't really concerned about it, and that's why Alan Tudyk is voicing so many different characters in Creature Commandos. I think it's just interesting, right? I think also, again, just leaning into the whole Gods and Monsters angle, that I think it's interesting how we're starting to build up a lot of these villain movies, quote-unquote villains, because they could be sympathetic characters later on, and all this kind of stuff. So we'll see. We'll see where it goes, but I'd be very curious to see where a Clayface film, goes from here. I'd be very curious to see how it connects to characters like Swamp Thing, even Batman in The Brave and the Bold. Is it gonna, is Batman gonna show up in this film, or is it gonna be more of an isolated thing? And I think that, again, it remains to be seen what the overall direction is, because James Gunn talked about the fact that, again, they're not greenlighting movies, they're not putting movies out unless the scripts are done. But then, is there a kind of overall plan? Is Chapter 1 Gods and Monsters just based on loosely based on the kinds of movies that are coming out, or is there going to be a team up movie, an overarching movie, and is there going to be something to look forward to? I don't know. It remains to be seen. The DCU is obviously still in very early days. So guys, let me know in the comments down below. Are you excited for a potential Clayface movie? And yeah, what do you think? What do you expect from it? Is it going to be more horror centric? Is Alan Tudyk going to be playing him and voicing him again? Let me know in the comments down below.